This is going to be Barksdales Brigade at Gettysburg, Part 7, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. As we talked about in Part 6, the high ground over there, you can see the high ground. You can only see a portion of the top of Sherfy's house and barn here. And this is where the regiment began to split as Barksdale ordered the 21st Mississippi straight ahead in the peach orchard, as the other three headed in this direction and wheeled to the left. As the brigade passed and got toward this area here, heading toward the Trossel farm, they were halted by fire from the 120th New York near the Trossel farm. The soldiers that were covered with dust at that time and blackened by the battle, had their ranks depleted briefly, came to a pause. Colonel Holder and Griffin urged Barksdale to reform, but he exclaimed to them, "No, crowd them. We have them on the run. Move your regiments." A moment later, Barksdale shouted, "Brave Mississippians, one more charge, and the day is ours." At this time, cheers rang out from the ranks, and Barksdale led on this one more charge that he spoke of. This has been Barksdales Brigade at Gettysburg, Part 7, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. Brigade at Gettysburg, Part 8, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. After a brief halt and heading here toward the Trossel farmstead, which you can see, Barksdales Brigade then headed into this area, which is known as the Plum Run Swale. This was right after Barksdale shouted, "Let's make one more charge, don't stop." Slightly wheeling to the right, they headed to Cemetery Ridge, in toward the swale here at Plum Run. In front of them was Willard's Brigade, which were standing very firm. In fact, officers from Willard's Union Brigade said, "Will nothing stop these men?" And another officer stated that he thought the day was lost right here. And if you remember, the day almost was lost here because the Union line almost broke over there where you see the Pennsylvania monument. If it had not been for some soldiers in the 1st Minnesota that got there just in the nick of time. As Barksdale's men entered the swale of woods that lined Plum Run, Colonel Humphreys led his men through Plum Run and captured some of the 5th United States Artillery, Company I, which you can see their monument dead center. But they were unable to turn the guns at the enemy because the retreating soldiers had taken the friction primers out of the guns. So Barksdale's brigade is now here near Plum Run, where the trees lined Plum Run, and that's right here in front of us. As he excited the trees along Plum Run, William Barksdale, under attack of George Willard's New York Brigade, made a shrieking sound. And this is where Barksdale, right here in this area, was mortally wounded, and we'll talk about that on our next part. This has been Barksdale's Brigade at Gettysburg, Part 8, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. At Gettysburg, Part 9, on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. And as you can see, we've reached Plum Run here, just behind the Trossel farmstead in the distance. Now, not many people ever travel into this little swale. This is one of the neater secrets of the battlefield, an area that doesn't get much of visitation. There's no monuments or markers in this immediate area. The closest ones would be that of the 5th United States Artillery over there in the distance. And of course, if you look closely through the trees here, you can see the top of the Pennsylvania monument. But this very peaceful spot here And again, from wartime records, just as Barksdale's brigade crossed this run, in sight of the 5th United States Artillery, which is just in the distance on the hill, William Barksdale made a shrieking sound. He was struck on horseback by a rifle ball above the left knee, and just a moment later, he was struck by a cannonball near his left foot, and then finally struck again by a ball to the breast, which knocked him from his horse. Confederate soldiers grabbed him, but the tide of battle then turned. Willard's New York Brigade had gotten the upper hand, and in the confusion of retreat, Barksdale was left behind. Now, 2 men who had found him, which was Private Joseph C. Lloyd of the 13th Mississippi, was one of them, and he tried to give Barksdale water, but his canteen had been shot through. Now, this is one of the sacred spots on the battlefield. It's one of the most misunderstood because not many people know where Barksdale was mortally wounded at, or where he died at. From records, he was wounded, mortally wounded, right here in this immediate area, just crossing Plum Run, not in the distance from the 5th United States, where Willard's New York Brigade was. And unlike Armistead, who has a marker designating where he was wounded, there is nothing for General William Barksdale. And that's the purpose of this video. It's a twofold purpose. One, earlier this year, the great author Harry W. Fonts had passed away. And a lot of the research I did for this video was based on Fonts' book, Day 2 at Gettysburg. And of course, that's very sad. And of course, the incident here with William Barksdale is sad because he was a great commander. On Barksdale's brigade at Gettysburg. And it was after dark on the 2nd, after Barksdale had been wounded, that rumors began to spread through the Union Army that Barksdale had been wounded. David Parker of Company C of the 14th Vermont stated that after dark, Colonel William T. Nichols asked for volunteers to go out and find General Barksdale. 3 men took on this mission. These soldiers searched amongst the dead in this field in front of us during the night of July 2nd, and at 11 p.m. they found General Barksdale very mortally wounded in the field. Private Parker spoon-fed coffee to Barksdale, who was bleeding internally. Barksdale informed Private Parker that in order for him to be moved, they would need a stretcher. Now that was because Barksdale weighed 240 pounds, which at that time was a very large man. Barksdale, as he was being carried from the field on a stretcher, told Parker, "I am leaving a good and loving wife and 2 sons. My wife, it will be hard for her. Tell her that my last words were of love to her. But my boys, it seems that I cannot leave them. The loss will not be fully comprehended. They need a father, as I have loved them, and I leave them. It is the hardest thing I ever know. Tell them that I died like a brave man and fearlessly in the fight. I have never regretted the steps that I have taken, and dying, I do not regret them now." And he began to pray, "God, ever watch over her and care for her and my boys. May God be a father to them as I was, and may, as I was brave, and I always defended the right." Now on this right here, we have an excellent view of Barksdale's charge. Way out over a mile in the distance, you can see the Confederate line. You can actually see the top of the Sherfy barn in the distance here, the high ground of the salient of the peach orchard, and then when they began to wheel in this direction past the Trossel farm, which you can see over here, toward the Plum Run swale. And just between these 2 trees right here, on this side of the swale, is where Barksdale was mortally wounded. And then, of course, Private Parker and the 2 other volunteers carried Barksdale on a stretcher to an aid station along the Town Road, and we'll take a look at that aid station. As we turn around, the aid station that we're talking about in the distance as we walk here was the Jacob Hummelball House, and that is where General Barksdale expired the very next day. These men carried him probably across the fields close to where I am walking right now to the Hummelball House, and we will shoot our final video on this series there at the Hummelball Farm, and it has quite an interesting story behind it as well. This has been our next part here on Barksdales Brigade at Gettysburg on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook. At Gettysburg, our final part here, and we're standing in front of the Jacob Hummelball House. And this is where Private Parker and the two others carried him to this aid station, which was being used as an aid station for the 2nd Corps of the Union Army. Now the house and the barn were full of wounded, and bed and blankets were brought for Barksdale and placed in the yard. Now the assistant surgeon of the 148th Pennsylvania Volunteers, his name was Alfred T. Hamilton. He examined General Barksdale, and while this was happening, Barksdale began to regain his consciousness and asked Dr. Hamilton if the wound was mortal. Hamilton informed him that he would pass away very soon. Now, musician Robert A. Cassidy of Company H of the 148th Pennsylvania gave the general water here in the yard where he was dying. All Hamilton could do was prescribe morphine for the pain. Barksdale said to Hamilton, "I want peace, but peace would recognize the South's independence." He then warned General Hamilton, and in doing so, in a delirium, warning the Union Army, "Beware, you will have Longstreet thundering in your rear in the morning." And of course, around 7:30 p.m. on the morning of July 3rd, 1863, General William Barksdale breathed his last and died here at the Jacob Hummelball House in the yard. And this was the end of Barksdale's life. Not too long after that, his wife would come to Gettysburg, and she would actually bring Barksdale's favorite dog. And this dog, even though Barksdale had been taken from the field and the ground, the dog would go by where Barksdale was originally buried here in the yard and would not leave, almost standing guard over the first resting spot of General William Barksdale. One of the stories, I guess you could say ghost stories, that swirl around this particular property today is that sometimes you can hear the dog of William Barksdale here barking and howling at the Hummelball Farm. But this has been a video series in tribute to the Confederate hero General William Barksdale of Mississippi. The story of his life, his military as well as his political career, and then of course one of the grandest charges ever in the American Civil War. The one more charge that he wanted at Gettysburg to break the Union line on July 2nd of 1863. A charge that was definitely a possibility, but in the end had failed, and of course it cost Barksdale his life. This has been Barksdale's Brigade at Gettysburg on Gettysburg Battlefield Facebook.